So in this video, we'll be looking at arguments for capital punishment. I'm getting many of these arguments from Vidal's chapter of the Oxford Handbook of Practical Ethics. So this handbook is a very good resource for me, and it's pretty up to date. So I tend to use it a lot. In any case, Vidal has some of the most recent arguments for and against capital punishment. So I want to start with some of the more recent stuff, and we'll kind of work backwards from there. That seems fitting for this unit. So Van de Hague, it's in 1986. I believe it was a book that he published. In any case, this argument that Van de Hague gives, it isn't exactly new, but it is interesting that this type of argumentation is still kind of being used to promote the idea of capital punishment. So here is Van de Hague's basic premise. Instilling fear, that's what we need to do. The severity and finality of the death penalty is a greater deterrent than the threat of imprisonment. Put another way, common sense tells us that the threat of death is greater than the threat of imprisonment. And we want to deter criminals, so we must leave the threat of death as a possibility. So the idea here, it's not exactly the deterrent itself. I mean, that is ultimately, right, what you want to do, but indirectly through fear. So fear is kind of the primary rationale for capital punishment, and it does remind us a little bit of the Romans crucifying several thousand, rebellious ex-slaves. It is a form of state-sponsored terrorism, or state-promoted fear, right? What would you call that other than terrorism? So it seems that this is a very old view, but it's still being put forward as a justification for capital punishment. Now, just like Vidal does in his chapter on the Oxford Handbook, I'll add comments to each and every one of these arguments as we go through them. So here's the first comment. It appears that thousands do not fear capital punishment enough to not kill. For example, in the 1990s, there were roughly 15,000 killers per year in states with the death penalty on the books. So if fear is what you're trying to produce, it's actually not exactly clear that capital punishment, as it is currently being practiced, is actually causing it, right? So that justification might not be a good one, perhaps not for moral reasons, but for an empirical reason. It just doesn't actually cause the fear that you think it does. This is also from Vidal. Moreover, if fear is what one is after, why not threaten murderers with death preceded by torture, as during the days of public executions? So I will have more to say about that in the food for thought. That's not exactly, something that people really take seriously. So when Vidal says this, he means it like a reductio ad absurdum. He's trying to say, if you really want, to instill fear, why don't we just go back to the old days? And he sees that as an argument against the position. But in my experience, I've talked to people who aren't exactly against it, or some students kind of express feelings of that sort. So I'm going to go ahead and give you some of my own reasons why we shouldn't bring back public executions in the food for thought. Okay, well, so much for Van de Hague. Let's go further back in time. Walter Burns, 1979. This is also a book, and he also essentially condensed his own book into a chapter that gets inserted into various readers. But in any case, Burns makes the following case. He says that justice demands punishment. So he connects it actually to emotions. Anger is connected to justice. It is morally right to be angry with criminals and to express that anger publicly, officially, and in an appropriate manner. As such, this may require the worst criminals to be punished with death. If this anger is not alleviated, people will take out this anger on their own terms. So, of course, Burns himself made this case. Bedell also summarizes Burns' argument. It is, at this point, it seems to be connected with kind of positive consequences or avoiding negative consequences. You want to basically avoid vigilanteism, and you want to essentially, alleviate that tension that crime creates, right? That desire for retribution. So that's essentially maybe one of the main points that he makes, but he makes an equally important point, does Burns, and I think it's a good one to talk about. So here's what he says. Moreover, capital punishment reminds criminals of the majesty of the moral order that is embodied in our law. The law possesses a dignity. We give it that dignity by imposing the ultimate penalty on those who chose to break it. So that is clearly more so a social contractarian perspective, right? There's something special about the law and we have to protect it at all costs. So it looks like Burns has a multi-pronged attack, right? He's making the case from what you might consider moral emotions. He's also arguing about, alleviating tension so that people don't become vigilantes. He's also talking about, the majesty of the moral order. So he makes various arguments here, kind of all blended into one. So some typical responses to him, I'll comment on them right now. Why not? So comment, just because one is angry enough to kill another, it doesn't mean that it is morally permissible. Moreover, sometimes the law itself is immoral. Jim Crow laws, apartheid. So what's going on here, and this, by the way, is all from Nathanson, which you'll see in the next slide. But these are just, since Burns is essentially taking multiple ethical theories and kind of, getting their points to defend capital punishment, the response from Nathanson is just to take typical responses to those ethical theories and apply them to Burns. So the first thing is, moral emotions. We know that you want to kill someone. That doesn't make it okay. Same thing with contractarianism. The law is generally a good idea. It's a good way to, avoid the state of nature, according to Hobbes. But sometimes the law is immoral, and we have to recognize this, right? So that's a standard argument against social contract theory. So this is what's going on here. Nathanson just kind of, if Burns have a multi-pronged attack, Nathanson has a multi-pronged response, right? So that's what's going on here. Moreover, by renouncing the death penalty, we would affirm the sanctity of human life, and we would reinforce the principle that violence is morally permissible only in the case of self-defense. So there it is, Nathanson making a final point there that life has a sanctity to it, right? So it's not just the law, and the state would do better by setting the example of not, enforcing the law at any cost, but protecting life at any cost. So that is Nathanson's response. Okay, let's jump back like 100 years. John Stuart Mill, 1868. Remember, this is the only philosopher we're covering, I think, that actually had a political post. He was a member of parliament, and we have one of his speeches. So I have here a long quote, which he gave in a speech, and let's take a look at it. When there has been brought home to anyone by conclusive evidence the greatest crime known to the law, and when the attendant circumstances suggest no palliation of the guilt, no hope that the culprit may even yet not be unworthy to live among mankind, nothing to make it probable that the crime was an exception to his general character rather than a consequence of it, then I confess it appears to me that to deprive the criminal of the life of which he has proved himself to be unworthy solemnly to blot him out from the fellowship of mankind and from the catalogue of the living, is the most appropriate, as it is certainly the most impressive mode in which society can attach to so great a crime the penal consequences which for the security of life it is indispensable to annex to it. So I know sometimes it's a little difficult to understand, the English from the 19th century, but that line, blot him out, that basically tells you what Mill is thinking to himself. And so here is a standard consequentialist perspective on punishment of this sort. I'll give it to you as a modus ponens. 1. If the threat of capital punishment can serve as a deterrent for future crimes, then capital punishment is morally permissible. 2. The threat of capital punishment is a deterrent for future crimes. That's an empirical claim, but one that Mill seems to have believed. 3. Therefore, capital punishment is morally permissible. The idea here being very simple. We punish criminals so as to ensure that they don't either commit future crimes or so that other criminals see their punishment and they decide not to commit future crimes, right? So this type of argumentation is extremely common among utilitarians. The very first utilitarian, Jeremy Bentham, well, maybe he wasn't the first, but the one who basically formalized the theory and codified it, Jeremy Bentham, a couple of decades before John Stuart Mill, made a very similar argument. So let me give that to you now. Bentham's is an either-or kind of argument. He says capital punishment can prevent crime either by incapacitation of criminals, so they can commit no further crimes because they'll be dead, or by deterrence of would-be criminals, such that they don't commit the crimes they otherwise would have committed. Right? So either I'm a criminal and you catch me and you kill me, so I can't commit any further crimes, or I was going to become a criminal, but then I saw people getting killed for the crimes that I committed and decided, you know what, maybe I'm not going to commit this crime. So that's the idea here behind the consequentialist approach. Now, I waited to give you a comment on these because they're basically relying on an empirical premise on deterrence, that punishment actually does deter criminals from more crimes. But it appears, per Bedau at least, and all his references, which I read some of them, and they sound pretty good actually. So here's a comment. Professional criminologists are in virtually complete agreement that there is no convincing empirical evidence that the death penalty is a deterrent marginally superior to long-term imprisonment. In other words, life imprisonment without parole is essentially the same as insofar as deterring criminals or incapacitating criminals than is the death penalty. So you can take a look at that. I'm going to give you some resources so you can take a look at. The ACLU also makes a case for this, and it's interesting. What I actually want to pivot to right now, though, because this conversation about deterrence might be better to talk about in a sociology class or something like that, something more social science heavy. Now, we are covering a bunch of social science in this class, but this will be, I think, more fitting for a sociology class. What I'd like to talk about now is the mere possibility that capital punishment actually has the reverse effect on society. So this is, it blew my mind when I first found out about it. Now, this also should be covered in a sociology class, but I'd like to just mention the idea. So it appears that Karl Marx was the first to suggest that executions have a brutalization effect, meaning that executions reduce the public's respect for life. This claim is supported both by statistical evidence and by clinical interviews with persons who committed murder because, they said, they were afraid to commit suicide and wanted the state to execute them. So this is, at least for me, it was kind of mind-blowing that there's a possibility that it's not only that capital punishment doesn't have a deterrent effect, but it actually might raise the rate of homicide. Societies that have capital punishment tend to have higher rates of homicide. That, to me, is just absolutely fascinating. I mean, the exact opposite of what you would have thought. I mean, at least for me, intuitively. Or maybe I read a little too much John Stuart Mill. In any case, let's move on here to the final theory we'll be looking at today. None other than Immanuel Kant. Well, what does Kant say? Well, at this point, it shouldn't be too surprising to know that Kant disagrees with Mill. Now, Kant came before Mill, so he didn't directly disagree with Mill, but he disagreed with consequentialism, is a better way to put it. So, here's what Kant says. To punish a criminal as a deterrent for future crimes would be using them as a means to an end. So, if you punish criminal A to make sure that criminals B, C, and D don't commit crimes, clearly you're using A, criminal A, as a tool, as a means to an end, as an example, right? So that, of course, violates the categorical imperative, especially in the humanity formulation, right? So that's Kant's basic view on the consequentialist argument, basically that it's wrong. To try to rehabilitate the convicted criminal, however, would be to violate the criminal's autonomy. So Kant being, of course, Kant here, autonomy is everything, so don't do that either. Once guilt is determined, then, the appropriate amount of punishment is determined by the crime itself, a concept known as retribution. The punishment for death is death. So this is typically surprising for people. Mill and Kant, or the consequentialists and deontological thinkers, tend to disagree on basically every issue that matters. Not all of them, as we will come to see, but certainly a lot. And in this case, they don't. They're both for capital punishment, although not for the same reason, which is typical of them. Kant just believes that you need to have a punishment that is proportional to the crime. And of course, nothing is proportional to, homicide, like having yourself be killed, right? So death is definitely the appropriate punishment, thinks Kant. So with that said, let's look at a final comment here against this kind of view that Kant endorses. Comment: arson, burglary, embezzlement, child abuse, serial or multiple murder, treason, espionage, and tax evasion are among the scores of crimes deserving severe punishment. But it is impossible to make any of them punishable by a punishment that fits, quote unquote. So if that's the standard of punishment, that it must fit or be proportionate to the crime, well, then that sort of doesn't make sense for most crimes. And that seems to not be a principle that you can actually abide by most of the time. It seems kind of just like a justification that you use for capital punishment. It sounds like a nice justification in the case of capital punishment, but really, it isn't something you can generalize, and so it doesn't make a ton of sense to have that as your, underlying principle for how to decipher which kind of punishments people deserve.